So today is the third and final part for this first project, the mixed media self-portrait. I wanted to review a little bit what we did in part one and part two. In part one, remember I had accumulated a bunch of pieces of paper and images and stuff that I found in magazines, and none of it, the content wasn't really important. What I was looking for was primarily just interesting textures and colors. I tore pieces of paper up and cut them up and arranged them in my area composition window until I came up with something that I thought would be an interesting background for the portrait. At that point in the process, I hadn't really been thinking too much about what the portrait would eventually look like. I was more just responding in the moment to the colors and the composition itself, not really planning too far ahead. The second week, which was last week, I did a graphite drawing on just a regular piece of drawing paper. Then I scanned that drawing into the computer and manipulated it a little bit with Photoshop. I increased the contrast, value contrast. I changed the graphite line to a blue line, and I added a little bit of value to the shirt area. Then I printed that out on a laser printer and did a photo transfer of that drawn image onto the collage. In Photoshop, I also flipped the image horizontally, so as I did the process of photo transfer, it would correct itself and end up in the correct orientation. So that's what we've done so far: collage and photo transfer. With collage and photo transfer, there's a strong tendency for the composition to become really fragmented, because we have a lot of disparate kinds of information. We have a lot of photographs with different kinds of images with different subject matter. All of the photographs are really crisp and high color and high contrast, so it starts to get a little bit muddled, and it's hard to tell what the composition is about because there's a lot of things competing for our attention. So the challenge becomes with when we're doing collage and combining a bunch of disparate images and types of information, visual information, the challenge becomes figuring out how to unify that into a clear visual communication. In this case, the point of my image is very clear. It's supposed to be a self-portrait. So I know that that's the center. That's what I want this image to be about. Looking at the image as it stands now, that's not very clear. It's not very clear that this image is about the self-portrait, because we have these little blips of high color, high saturation, this little strip of red. There's high value contrast in spots that aren't necessarily having to do with the face. The background, the clouds are really colorful and interesting to look at. And the face itself, even though it's a line drawing, so it stands out because of that, doesn't really pop out. It doesn't really stand out as the most interesting part of the composition. So the idea here is I'm going to use oil paint to fix that, to try to unify all these little blips, pieces, little bits of information, to try to make that into a cohesive portrait. Whenever you have areas that are emphasized or stand out, usually that is a product of contrast. Our eyes are drawn to contrast. So if I want something to not stand out, I need to decrease the contrast or de-emphasize that part of the composition. And the converse is also true. If I want something to stand out more and to be more of a focal point, I need to increase the contrast. So what you're going to see today in this broadcast is similar to what you saw last week. It's going to be a video of me painting this final step. I didn't think you would appreciate sitting through 2 hours of painting, so I sped it up quite a bit. And then instead of adding music to the video, what I did is I'm going to talk over the video and try to explain some of the thought process that I went through as I painted. So you'll kind of get a feel for what I was thinking as I was making decisions as far as what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize, where to add contrast, etc. So that is what we're going to do right now. We're going to see a video of the final step in this project: oil paint on our collage and photo transfer. At the start here, I'm wanting to address large areas first. Usually you want to work general to specific. You want to address large issues, large relationships, and then come back and get increasingly smaller and more refined. So here I'm just using a hog's hair bristle brush to dump on color, very transparent. In this case, I'm not worried about how much paint I put on there or how much color I put on there because I'm using oil paint. So, I don't have to worry about drying time like with acrylic. So I just dump it on there liberally and don't worry too much about how it looks. And then I come back and once I have things in there very loose and general, I come back and wipe it away and refine it from there. Generally with oil and acrylic paint, you want to work dark to light. Right now you see me blocking in some highlight areas. This is because typically early on in a painting, I try to establish the extremes, the extremes of value, the lightest and the darkest. And that having those two value extremes gives me kind of a context for the rest of the color of the painting. So it is true that you normally want to work dark to light, and I do generally do that. In this case, I put that highlight color in there just to give me a sense for a point of comparison, to have that light value extreme in there. And that kind of gives me a gauge for the rest of the color and value as I block everything else in. As I go along here, I am addressing large areas. I'm not getting into any details like eyelashes or wrinkles or anything like that. I'm trying to keep it pretty simple, and then I increasingly get more refined and more detailed. I'm also very aware of how much of the drawing I want to keep in the image. So it's hard to really teach that or explain that, but I am making decisions constantly about how opaque to make the paint. How much of the drawing and how much of the collage do I want to come through? And this has everything to do with what I was talking about, of emphasizing and de-emphasizing. I want to de-emphasize areas that aren't as important or that are maybe coming across too strong, and I want to emphasize areas that are perhaps currently too weak and not standing out enough or strong enough. So you see that right now I'm addressing that big red stripe. I don't want to get rid of it entirely. In fact, I like those little blips of saturated red coming through, but it is definitely too strong. Throughout the painting, I'm going to constantly be moving around, never spending too much time in one area. The temptation is always to start developing and getting really detailed in an area before you're ready for it. And in fact, you got to kind of develop a short attention span almost, like you get disinterested in an area after a very short time. This keeps you moving around the image and not letting yourself develop any one area too quickly ahead of everything else. If you do tend to focus and lock in on one area and get really detailed too quick, what happens is it starts to feel like the painting's fragmented. It starts to feel like individual paintings rather than a cohesive whole. It really does, it makes good sense, and it's to your benefit to keep working around the whole image and not spend too much time in any one area. This is kind of an atypical painting. I am not following strictly good traditional painting practice. I am kind of going back and forth between lights and darks. It's interesting just for me to watch this painting go by real fast, because sometimes, I do things just out of habit, and I'm not thinking about them too much in the moment. But the reason that happens in this particular instance is, again, because I'm trying to figure out how transparent or opaque to make the paint. So sometimes I realize as I am developing the image that I wasn't opaque enough or I wasn't dark enough, and it becomes much more back and forth between dark and light rather than, you know, the more traditional approach of starting with the darks and pulling the lights out of from there. Here what I've done is put a little bit of the medium liquid on my brush just to loosen up that paint and allow me to pull more of that, to wipe it off. So the liquid, scrubbing that surface with the liquid a little bit will help me get off more of the paint when I wipe it with a paper towel. I want it to be really light along the edge of the shoulders there. And I'm sorry I didn't position the camera very well. I'm getting my head up in there. So at this point in the painting, things are generally feeling okay with skin tone, the modeling, the highlights and shadows of the face are starting to come together. The face is definitely has become more prominent and is definitely more of a focal point and more central to the image. The clouds aren't pulling out as much. That little sharp edge off to the right there isn't as dominant, although it still is kind of a floating little bit of high contrast, which I'm going to need to address eventually. I decided that I wanted more of a transition between the clouds and that white grid area to the left side of the face there. So I'm trying to kind of create the sense of more shadows underneath the clouds that transition more, create more of a transition between the piece of cloud collage and the grid area. That bit of contrast also helps to make the highlight side of the face stand out more. And then here I am decided to connect that little thorn collage element to a larger shape along the right side there. That will help frame the image and give that thorn something to ground it rather than having it just floating up in space there. I'm wiping away some of the glaze I did on the cloud area. I'll point out again that I've left the face and I'm working now in the background, even though the face is far from being done. There's a lot of detail work that has yet to be done. But I don't want to get too far along in the face before I start addressing the background, or again, the background and the face will start to feel like separate paintings, start to feel fragmented. So this is how I'm solving that, that area, that shape on the right. I'm making it kind of like, look like a tree or something. Really, I'm just trying to emphasize or support the light logic that I've established in the photograph and in the background, that this light source is coming from top right, and having a consistent light logic with the foreground and the background elements will help tie them together in our sense of that space, and the figure will start to occupy that space a little bit better because we're given these visual cues telling us that they are getting hit by the same light source. So it doesn't really matter to me that you really understand what that brown lumpy shape is to the right there. Really, it's just a visual element there to hopefully strengthen the composition and provide a little bit of contrast and an interesting shape. I also, again, remember I like that little thorn shape that threatens the side of the face there, so I wanted to keep that in there. At this point in the painting, I started to realize that what I really liked about that negative space, the background space, was this pathway that was happening from the, right along the shoulder line, that little light line that passed behind the head and then up around the right side there, and then there's that little break in collage elements that happens between the purple of the sky and the thorn piece collage element. So I used a little bit of white to de-emphasize or make the black lines of the grid a little bit less prominent in an attempt to emphasize that visual pathway, that kind of way that visual pathway that passes behind the head and then off the page, off to the right. That pathway kind of became more important to me as I was kind of thinking about this story that I was creating here, that I was telling in this portrait. I like this idea that that my eyes were looking off in that direction. And you'll remember this is something that came up after I did the collage originally. That little break I liked a lot and wanted to do something with that. So that's why I took the photograph that I did. But it's becoming even more present here, this pathway that happens and leads us off the page. I like that as a narrative element to this portrait, maybe suggesting that the portrait is looking into the future, or that there's this sense of progress or hope, or I don't know. I think there's many things that you could read into that. Hopefully good, not negative. But I think generally it felt like an interesting bit of story to add, so that it's not just not just a face or not just a backdrop for the face, but it actually adds to something to what the image says. And from here on out, I think it's pretty much all just refining, adding details, getting smaller and smaller with my brush strokes and mark making, getting more and more detailed, refining the drawing a little bit. In the first part of the painting, I tend to just address large areas and dump a lot of color and paint down. And then as I go along, I'll get softer brushes and I'll just move the paint that's already there around and soften things and pull paint off as needed. At this point, I'm also noticing that the neck is looking really, really blue. So at some point, I'm going to be addressing that. I decided to make that drawing blue, thinking that it would be a nice point of contrast for these warm skin tones. Ultimately, I don't know if that worked out as well as I had planned or had hoped it would. I ended up mostly getting rid of the blue, and I didn't really let it come through too much. But I did keep a lot of, even though you can't see it's blue, I did keep a lot of those lines visible. So here I'm using a little bit of warmth to burnt sienna or burnt umber to try to calm down that blue a little bit and make it more look more like skin tone. As I'm refining the image and refining the painting, getting smaller and more detailed, I also look for ways that I can add little points of high contrast that maybe aren't obvious when you look at them, maybe not value contrast, but putting little blips of saturation, for instance, in the nose or the lips or in the tear duct on the eye. What this does is it just kind of, when the viewer gets closer to the image or they get a look at it longer, you're kind of giving them payoff. You're giving them a way to, you give them a little extra, a reward for their extra attention. It's a nice way to just add a little bit of excitement, a little bit of visual interest to the image. And then finally, I'm trying to bring in some of that purple from this clouds, again to try to connect the foreground, the portrait, to the environment. That cloud, or the purpley cloud, would probably cast some light, would be a weak secondary light source, and you'd probably pick up a little bit of that light on the tops of the shoulders. So I was trying to tie in the foreground and background a little bit. And then finally, the moment of reckoning. First, I'm going to take a straight edge and an X-Acto knife and very gently cut along the edges of my composition window, and I can see where that is based on that extra tape that went beyond the composition area. I can align the straight edge with those little pieces of tape that extend off to the top and bottom, right and left, and that will kind of tell me where the edges of the composition are. And I kind of lightly run the blade over that edge to cut through the layers of collage that go outside of the image area and that are, that are currently on top of the green tape. And then hopefully I haven't cut through the watercolor paper. You want to be careful not to do that, and that's another reason to use a thicker, more robust piece of paper. I can peel the green tape off, and I should be left with a fairly straight, sharp line defining the composition. You want to be careful not to pull too quickly, and you want to make sure that you have cut through the layers of collage, or you could get a torn, kind of rough looking edge. This is always a very satisfying moment in the life of the painting. It seems to just tighten everything up when you tear off the masking tape. As with most of, well, any kind of art, I could have spent hours and hours more fiddling with this and making it better and refining and noodling it to death. And in fact, that's usually what I do. But I had a time limit on this. My time limit was nap time. I had to get this broadcast finished, completed, and out to you in that span of time, which is always a good thing. Time limits are a very good thing in helping you just finish your work. So overall, I'm quite pleased with the result, though, and I think we achieved our objective of taking all these disparate collage elements and visual bits of information and emphasizing the portrait and de-emphasizing the negative space or background, so that it's clear that this is about the portrait. One final thing that I wanted to mention before closing out here is that this is a very compressed, even though I showed you 2 hours worth of painting, even still this project is a very compressed version of what I would normally do in my own work. Just because I'm trying to give this to you in a clear way, I tend to strip complexity out and try to boil things down to the very simplest and most basic steps, so you can get an idea of what I'm trying to teach. Normally, though, each one of these steps could be repeated several times and gone back and forth. So remember, with the collage and the photo transfer, those are both acrylic paint processes. I'm using acrylic matte medium for the glue. So I could do, after I do the step number 2 with the photo transfer, I could go back and collage more. After I collage more, I could do another photo transfer and do multiple layers of that. I could then paint with acrylic paint on top of that with transparent and opaque layers, and then I could go back and collage again. This doesn't have to be a sequential process. Nor does it have to be a doing one step and then moving on and never going back. It can be a cyclical thing. You can do these things out of order and in any order, repeating them as many times as you'd like. So as with all my projects, I hope you get the idea of what is possible, or you get the vision of what's possible with these, combining these different techniques and materials to create a final result that ultimately, hopefully, is more interesting than if you had used only one of these techniques or mediums by themselves. There's a great breadth that you can get when you start combining these different approaches to art making. So remember, on Dablon.com, you can go in and log into if you have an account, you can go in and upload images of projects that you come up with, that you create in response to these demonstrations. I hope you'll be willing to share your results, and don't be shy. Don't feel like you're not good enough or whatever. There's a lot we can learn from each other as we share the results of our efforts, and I think that we will all gain a great deal as the more that you're willing to share. So go and upload your creation, and good luck, and make sure you shoot me an email if you have any questions. Thanks a lot, and this is the end of Project 1 Mixed Media Self-Portrait.